Hello.
So why don't we start with having you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with the film and what you did as a co-producer, what it means to be responsible for all the Japanese aspects of the film.
Sure. I'll try my best. So I started to work in the film industry here in New York, and I worked on a very independent Japanese film that shot entirely here in New York. And we had mostly an American crew, some lead Japanese actors and so forth, and it was made for the Japanese market. But, and I was a second AD on that, and I'm quite bilingual, and so I had a lot of translating and production logistics to handle, and that was my responsibility. But I had met someone who was the production manager of that project, and he happened to be the line producer of Lost in Translation. Now he's like the producer of Star Wars. His name is Callum Green, so he really kind of moved up in the world. But so Callum gave me a call, and he said, I was based in Tokyo at the time, but he said, I have an interesting independent film, and we might need some help. What are you doing? And I said, who's the director? And he wouldn't tell me, because that's the way the film business kind of works. I guess he wasn't allowed to tell me yet. And we kind of went back and forth for a while. I was like, yeah, I could help you with this film. I know a lot of like really good filmmakers in Japan and like young, energetic crew people. Who's the director? And he'd be like, we're coming to Japan in a few weeks, blah, blah, blah. Finally, like I kind of like said, I need to know who the director is before I try to help you guys. And he said, it's Sofia Coppola. So I was like, oh, I know that name. And at that time, she made a film called Virgin Suicides, which I really liked. So, I said, hey, why not? Let me try to help you guys. And then it took a while before they sent me a script, but Sophia and Callum and a few others came to Japan to do a scout for the shoot. And I had set up some locations for them to visit and so forth. And I met Sophia, and she was kind of very quiet and intuitive. And she was like, I'm jet lagged. We don't need to see all the places that you set up. Why don't we just go have a nice meal? So we ended up going to Asakusa, which is like the older part of town. And we went to Sensoji, which is like an old temple there. And we kind of like lit a candle at Sensoji. And by the time we had tendon, which is like a really nice comfort food, like tempura over rice, she was like, I decided who the local producer guy is going to be, so we're done. And she was like, I'm jet lagged, I'm going home, back to the hotel, and I'll see you in a few weeks when we shoot. So, and that was the gentle beginning to what became kind of like Apocalypse Now in my life. But then, next thing I knew, we were trying to put this film together very quickly.
So being in charge of all the Japanese aspects of the film means literally that, like you were casting, you had control of how much of the budget to...
Yeah, I think it's probably the only case that stands to this day, but we set up ourselves as a completely independent film, much in the style of an independent film here shot in the US. So there was this company called Lost in Translation, Inc., which was set up by Sophia and her father and a few others in California, and I set up a company called Lost in Translation Japan. And I was fully in charge of that company, but Sophia was actually a board member along with Callum and a few other producers. I still have that like article of incorporation. It's one of our family treasures. But so I was like the local guy in charge of everything we did for the production. And so we hired like the heads of departments came from America. So we were about 10% American, and the rest of the crew was fully Japanese. And so everybody hired locally, worked under me. So my butt was kind of on the line, but so I was put to a test, basically.
And the uniting thread of the films in this series is that they're shot in Tokyo by outsiders, so to speak. So I'm wondering, you grew up in Tokyo, this is your hometown. Was it important to you that the film kind of gets it right, so to speak, in terms of capturing the city or something of Japan?
Well, yes and no. I finally got to read Sophia's script like a few weeks before, and I immediately had to translate it into Japanese with my team, right? So everybody else who was working on the film could figure it out. But as I was doing that, I realized that this was a very unique vision. And I felt that it was important, first and foremost, that the Tokyo that she had in her mind is somehow put on the screen. And I have a unique insider-outsider perspective because my mother's Japanese and my father's American, and I went to an American school over there when I was growing up. So that's the feeling I wanted to capture. And to me, that's what Tokyo is all about. Like, if you ask me if I'm Japanese, I don't know. But if you ask me if I'm from Tokyo, I'm like, yes. And Tokyo, at least in the 20th century, later 20th century, has always had this kind of mixed cultural element as well. And I didn't feel at the time that there was a film which really captured that realistically. So I think what I wanted to do mostly was to, A, support Sofia's vision, but also to kind of help the city appear in the way that I knew it and I saw it, which was neither Japanese nor American. It was somewhere in between.
And how about what it means to shoot in Tokyo in practical terms? I hear it's quite difficult in terms of shooting permits and things like that.
Yes, it's very difficult, and I think in filmmaking, you could either try to force your will upon a difficult situation and fight things all the time, which many directors do, or you could kind of deal with the difficulty and let that mold your film into something very interesting. So one of the first things I tried to convey to my friends who came to visit from America was that we're not going to be able to film in Tokyo like you do in New York. We're not going to be able to shut down famous streets and avenues and get big lights and so forth, because that's just not possible there. So we chose to go the other route, which was to run and gun and be very nimble. And we actually did a lot of shooting without permits. Almost 20 years later, I could say it without being afraid to say so, but we actually did a lot of things without proper, permission. And the way we did it was we had a 35mm camera, but it was called, it's an Aton camera, which is quite lightweight for a 35mm camera. And our cinematographer, Lance Accord, was very smart about it. He chose film stock, which was very high speed, so we didn't need a lot of lighting. So there's a scene in the Ginza line, the subway, and that was just we snuck in, and it's called uchitora in Japanese, but you cast your crew. And we surrounded Scarlett with our own crew, and we just shot on the train. There's a scene in Hachiko Square in Shibuya, and we just hailed the taxi and hired the taxi for half a day. And Bill and Scarlett, I don't remember who was on the taxi or if they were both on it, but they were just on it, and they would just get out in the middle of Shibuya's, central square, and we just got our shots that way. I remember people would recognize Bill Murray, but he's known for Ghostbusters over there, and probably lost in translation now, but not as well as here. So there were people who were saying that's Tom Hanks. No, he's not, whatever. And by the time we got our shots, we were out of there. So, that's the approach that we took. And I think it kind of came through. I haven't seen this film in a while, but I think it shows that there's a certain kind of energy, which was very much we were younger and we were just getting our shots and running around Tokyo.
Yeah. And now it's been 16 years since it premiered, and it's kind of become, I don't know, a modern classic or one of the most well-known films where you're talking about foreign films shot in Japan. How do you feel about it now, 16 years later? You've rewatched it a few years ago?
Honestly, I haven't. It's interesting. So my life, and I think I could say this for many of us who worked on the film, our lives have kind of been changed and somewhat hijacked by Sofia's amazing vision. And I think it runs in the family. I think her father used to do this to other filmmakers as well. And I haven't been able to really watch this with any sort of perspective until maybe 7 years ago. I went with a few of my friends to see the film, and we were just finally able to just see it for what it was and understand what the story was, I think. So I'm curious to see how I would feel after I see the film again 7 years later. It's interesting. I changed, but the film doesn't. And then, to tell you about how we all felt as we were shooting, it was so tight, the schedule. We didn't know if we really had a film. The shabu shabu scene, for example, we got kicked out of the location very early, and we didn't know if the scene would cut together. And right after that scene, our crew had a breakdown, and we had this whole international meeting about what's wrong and so forth, and I could cry for hours about it. But Sarah Flack, who later became a friend, who edited the film, she really did an amazing job in piecing things together. So I think a lot of us, we realized that we really had something finally after the film was done. And even now, I'm amazed that there's so many people here to watch it.
Yeah, and I meant to ask this earlier, but how many of you will this screening be a rewatch? You've seen it already.
Oh, wow.
That says something. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So before we get started, don't want to put you on the spot, but any, anecdotes? Any funny anecdotes? We're curious about Bill Murray, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, and actually the most interesting ones, I'm still, to this day, not sure if I could share them. Really funny stories that I probably shouldn't share. But, oh my God, there's so many. But what I learned personally was thanks to Sofia, we had a team that was really amazing, and we all moved on thereafter to do very interesting things with our careers. But I think the people who I got to work with were super, super hungry to just get a little bit more. And we wouldn't stop. So speaking of Bill Murray, he left because all of his principal photography shots were done. And we released his stand-in. And then the cinematographer, Lance Accord, came to me on the very last day of shooting. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I was like, I could really use some sleep. I want to go home. I don't want to be bothered. And he's like, looking at my head, and he's like saying, "What are you doing? I actually want you for this shot." So I ended up sitting in a limousine, traveling through Tokyo on the highway, and Lance and his team were on another car. I became Bill Murray's stand-in. And he just wouldn't give up and stop. So and then the driver was saying there was a Brazilian shoot a week ago, and it was the same crazy business. Foreigners don't know what they're doing. You're not supposed to shoot on the highway, blah, blah, blah. And I was kind of calming him down, saying, "We're almost done. We're getting our shots." But so Bill Murray's very last shot is actually the back of my head. And so I always joke and say that he got nominated for an Oscar, but maybe 1/800th of that performance is actually I got to contribute, But it was really amazing to work with people like Lance and Bill and everybody, because they were just so into what they were doing, and they were great at juggling and kind of staying on their toes and getting the shots. And I hope you enjoy the film.
Okay, please join me in thanking Stephen for joining us tonight.